Hey guys, welcome back to Releasethecraftin. Priscilla here with another episode of Storycraft. Storycraft, which if you don't know, if you're just joining us, is a segment where I tell you a story and do a craft. And today, you guys, I have a doozy for you. But right off the top, before we jump into it, I just want to tell you guys, this video is going to come out a couple days before we start our next challenge, which will be the challenge for September, which is the Season of the Witch Challenge. That's hashtag RTC season. There's a video about it announcing it. If you haven't watched it already, definitely go check it out and get your prompt list so you can join in the fun. There's going to be a giveaway at the end, promo, all the things. It's here on the channel. If you're watching this from the far future, go check it out. I bet you it's pretty cool. I'm going to keep saying that in every video up until we get there, so deal with it. At any rate, you guys, are you ready to hear the story of Inês de Castro, the corpse queen of Portugal? And you guys, this isn't a ghost story necessarily, so much as it's a real historical thing that happened, and when I heard about it, I had to share it with you guys. I think this is perfect for spooky season, so I think you guys are going to really enjoy this. But this story takes place in what is now modern day Spain and Portugal, but in medieval times was also Portugal, but not quite as we know it today, but also a bunch of different city-states that made up the body of Spain. And this story is going to mostly take place in between Castile and Portugal. So that's where we are. I didn't do a lot of research into Spanish history and how all this came together, so I'm sorry I don't have that to provide more context for you guys, but I'm sure it's out there and it's very fascinating, so definitely check it out if you're interested in it. But what we need to know for the terms of this story is that there's Portugal and there's Castile. There is a state in the middle, and I forgot what it was called, so we're going to move right past that. But we're talking about these two places, and they're kind of at war. Not like all-out, full-blown war, but like they're fighting each other kind of constantly at this time. And it's around this time, somewhere between 1320 and 1325. A lot of sources differ, so nobody really knows for sure. Inês de Castro was born to her father, Pedro Fernandez de Castro, and her mother, who was her father's mistress. And unfortunately, even though both her parents have a very storied, distinct, noble lineage, her father himself actually being the illegitimate child, or illegitimate grandson, of Sancho IV, who was the king of Castile at some point, they have this great lineage, but because her father had a baby out of wedlock with his mistress, Inês is never legitimized, and this is going to be something that haunts her for the end of her days. Like, this is a big deal. And they never got married after the fact, so she never even had the opportunity to sort of beg for legitimacy, even though she comes from very, very good, high noble stock. She was sort of treated as a little bit less than because she wasn't legitimate. Now, that's not to say her father didn't treat her very well. She grew up with a fairly average childhood, and she lived just fine until she was either 15 or somewhere in between 15 and 20, when she ends up traveling to Lisbon with her cousin Constanza Manuel, so she could be Constanza's lady-in-waiting, because Constanza is engaged to marry the Prince of Portugal, Dom Pedro. And this marriage is basically an alliance in order to end the warring, battles between Portugal and Castile at the time. So when Inês and Constanza get to Lisbon and they are introduced to Pedro, Pedro decides, love at first sight, he is madly head over heels in love with Inês, not Constanza, the woman he's supposed to marry. And when he kind of hints that he's interested more in Inês, he gets shut down immediately by his father, King Alfonso of Castile, because she's illegitimate. And so he's like, absolutely not. You're not doing that to the family. You're a prince. You're going to marry noble. You're going to marry well. So he goes through with his marriage to Constanza and does all of his husbandly duties, but he also starts this very secret, quote-unquote secret, public affair, because everyone kind of knows about it and they're gossiping about it, but nobody draws a lot of attention to it because it's still kind of hush-hush, but everyone knows he's having an affair with Inês. And he does this very cleverly by sending her letters via aqueduct. So the estates that they were staying at were linked by an aqueduct, and he would take his messages and send them down the aqueduct for her to receive, and then they would meet up and carry on their affair. And they carried on this affair, guys, for years. years they had this affair. And you can only imagine how Constanza feels, because she's like, what the heck? I brought you with me so that you could like enjoy living in the laps of luxury as a future lady in waiting to the Queen of Portugal, and you're sleeping with my husband. So Constanza, trying to save face and also trying to break them up, decides that she's going to ask Inês to be her new son's godmother, which is a huge honor because this like kid is eventually going to one day be the King of Portugal. And you know, like everybody wants to be involved, but also very sneakily becoming the godmother to this child, according to the church, would make her a blood relative. So it would turn Inês into a family, not just like Constanza's cousin, who's distant and illegitimate, so we don't consider it. Now she's a blood family member of the royal family, which makes her affair with Pedro extra icky, but also a crime. Although our girl, Inês, was not a fool, so she turned this down, which was also very scandalous. In fact, it was so scandalous that she turned down this really gracious offer of being the godmother that it pissed off King Alfonso, who really hated their affair and really disliked Inês for no reason other than the fact that she was illegitimate and causing a scandal, which is very valid, you know, for being fair. If you're the King of Portugal, you don't want scandals on your doorstep. And so he decides to banish Inês to Castile in 1344. So around this time, she's about 24 to 29-ish. So she gets banished to go live in the Spanish countryside in Castile, Castellan countryside, I guess. And everything seems to be okay, although Pedro is very upset and mad at his dad. Not a lot happens, except that in 1345, Constanza dies after giving birth to her third child with Pedro, and Pedro didn't waste any time at all, you guys. He moved Inês back from Castile back to Portugal immediately, and then, although he won't reveal it later, it's around this time that it's believed that they maybe, possibly, unless he was lying, he may have totally been lying, married in secret. Which, if this was true, would put her in line to be the next queen when Pedro took the throne after his father dies. But by this point in time, Inês and Pedro had 4 children together. So, yeah, quite a few children. And the problem with them having all these children together is that if their union is legitimized, meaning if they are actually married and that's valid, it could not only just upset the order of succession, but it would disrupt the peace between Castile and Portugal. And King Alfonso was like, fuck no, absolutely not. We're not playing this game. We're going to cut this off right here. So in 1355, which is 10 years after Constanza died, which means they spent all this time together in their little estate pretending to be a happily married couple. It took this long for King Alfonso to be like, I'm done with this. But in 1355, King Alfonso orders the death of Inês. He feared a succession war and her seemingly overwhelming influence over his son. Like, he really couldn't stand the idea that Inês was able to basically make Pedro move heaven and earth just to be with her, that he was willing to sacrifice everything he had just to be with her. It really upset Alfonso. And he also could not stand the idea of an illegitimate noble because he's a classist, and we hate that. That's not cool. But he really couldn't take it. And it didn't even matter to him that she had a very prestigious bloodline because she was never legitimized. And somehow that was her fault. But he hated the idea of her having any position of power in the court. So in a last bid attempt, he orders her death, right? And Inês, hearing upon this, that the king is like, I want this girl gone, she takes all of her children and she goes to the king's court, throws herself at his feet, and starts to beg for her life. And she doesn't just beg for her life. She's like, think of the children. And she tells them, like, she'll go around the world to the coldest place on the planet, anything but death, as long as he doesn't kill her. And the king, it said, just stood up and walked out of the room. And as he was walking out, he tells the rest of the people hanging out in the court to do whatever you want, which is chilling. Anything could have happened to her if someone decided to be an opportunist. That's how little he cared for Inês, though. He was like, do whatever you want. This has nothing to do with me, and just left and didn't even acknowledge that she was begging for her life on the floor with all of his grandchildren in her arms, like also probably crying around her too. You would imagine if their mom starts crying, all these other kids are going to start crying too, especially if they think their mom's going to die. So that's how little Alfonso cared for Inês. He didn't even care for her children, which are also his grandchildren. So, unfortunately, it comes the day that assassins set out for Inês and Pedro's home, and they wait until Pedro departs for the day, and then they set upon Inês in front of her children. They kill her. And now some people say she was just stabbed and that was it and she died. The most crazy rumor of the time, though, is that they decapitated her in front of her children. And when Don Pedro gets home and he finds her, they left her dead on the floor with her children crying around her. And he knows immediately that his father is responsible. And he gets so mad that his father killed his lover that he ends up rallying a bunch of troops to basically start a civil war in the middle of Lisbon, Portugal. And they attacked the city, you guys, for months in retaliation. And this would have continued on, except that his mother, Beatrice of Castile, the Queen of Portugal, came out of the castle to ask him to stop. So him being a mama's boy, clearly, helped him end this war that he was starting in revenge and retaliation for his lover being murdered in front of their children, which is really unnecessary. So Pedro ends his war, continues to retire, and in 1357, Alfonso dies, and Pedro is crowned King Peter I of Portugal. And now, as King Peter, he wastes no time trying to get revenge for the people, like, against the people who killed Inês. So he sets out to find the people who were involved in the assassination of Inês de Castro, and he ends up finding two men, inviting them to dinner, and then at dinner has their hearts ripped out at the table. Which is metal. That's really metal. Also, if I was an assassin and the lover of the person I killed was like, hey, come to dinner, my answer would be no. Absolutely the fuck not. You got me fucked up. Because what? But they went. I guess maybe they felt like they couldn't refuse the order of the king. But then he has their hearts ripped out at the table, which is absolutely gruesome. It's so gruesome, in fact, that he ends up earning the moniker Peter the Cruel. Once everybody hears about it, they're like, our king is Peter the Cruel. And that's his name in history. Like, he gets that for the rest of time. Now, at this point, it's been at least, I emphasize, 2 years since her death, and Peter announces to the world, at this point, that he was actually married to Inês this entire time. And because they were married before her death, that makes her queen. And so, people start to question how legitimate this claim is, though. So King Peter calls on Bishop Gil. This is rough. I'm going to butcher every bit of Portuguese that's going to come up here, guys. But Bishop Gil Cabral de Viana as a witness to his claims. And Bishop Gil could not remember the exact date, but he did state that they were in fact wed. So, King Peter has Inês's body exhumed from the grave, brought to the royal court, dressed more richly than any person has ever been dressed in that court before. Like, he decked her out in the nines. And then has a throne set up for her right next to his. And they have a huge celebration for their wedding, for their marriage, and her coronation as queen. He has her actually crowned as queen, and she's the only woman in the entire world to be crowned posthumously as a queen. And then, because, you know, King Peter isn't just, like, going to be satisfied with that, right? He has to do one more thing. King Peter then demands that every noble in attendance at this event comes up there and pays her homage and, like, you know, offers their fealty by kissing her dead freaking hand. And they do, because his name is Peter the Cruel, and nobody else wants to get their hearts ripped out at the dinner table. So essentially, after this huge lavish party and this big feast where he's like, see, she's queen, I put her on the throne, which you have to imagine was like a promise that he made her while she was alive. Like, one day I'll be king and you'll be my queen. And he meant it. Like, he stuck to it. But after this, like, whole ceremony, this disgusting display of devotion by all of his people, I can't even imagine how bad she stank. Peter then has her interred in a marble sarcophagus, and then in 1360 or 1361, they move Inez to the royal monastery of Alcobaça. And she is laid to rest in that tomb. The tomb has a sculpture of her body being held up by little cherubic angels, and there was a giant procession when they moved her sarcophagus from one place to the other to inter her in this big fancy tomb. There was horses, a bunch of nobles, and thousands of candles. There were at least 1,000, they say, but the stories that greatly exaggerate this say that there were thousands of candles at her funeral procession. It lit up the day and the night. He wanted her to be enveloped in light all the way from her one resting place to the other, so that she was never out of the light. And then when King Peter dies a little bit later, he also has a tomb before he dies, of course, you guys. He had a tomb made of himself as a statue on the top, and then on the sides he had their entire affair sculpted out, including all the way up to his revenge. So on the side of his tomb is basically their entire love story and how he ended up cutting the hearts out of those two guys. That was really important to him to be on his tomb. And they are both currently residing in the royal monastery, and they are facing each other so that on the day of reckoning, on the final day, they will rise up together and be able to see each other as they rise up to heaven. And they have been resting next to each other for 650-ish years, and both of their tombs have an inscription that reads, until the end of the world. And that is essentially the end of the story of Queen Inês of Portugal. And there's a couple of interesting little bit of facts before I jump off here really quick. Nobody knows for sure if the whole kissing her hand, like the hand of the dead body, was an actual thing that happened or not. There's a lot of debate about that. It might be a rumor or story that was made up in order to support the whole Peter the Cruel narrative that was going around at the time. But I'm inclined to believe that it's true. It's also said that she haunts the villa that she was slain in, and there is blood, like a blood stain on her floor, which is actually just a reddish colored algae like stain that like just persists. But they are saying that that red algae is where her blood hit the floor, and you can still see it to this day. And again, I'm going to butcher this because it's in Portuguese, but there is a saying that is Inês já é morta. That means Inês is already dead, and it's basically what you say when someone tries to do something but it's already way too late. Inês is already dead. Which is also crazy that like her name has lived on to become part of like just regular idioms that people say in their culture now. And yeah, that's everything I have for you guys about the Corpse Queen of Portugal. Let me know what you guys think. When I heard this story, I was like, I absolutely have to share it. I don't do a lot of history little bits here, but I love history, and so like it's always a delight for me to learn something new, and I absolutely was just like radicalized into sharing this with you guys because it's just such a cool story. It's like they say it's like the Portuguese Romeo and Juliet, which I think it's even better because they were adults. Although, granted, Inês was probably 15-ish, somewhere in that ballpark. Hoping it's more towards the late teens than the early ones, like 18, 19, please, when she actually went to Lisbon and met Pedro, but I still think it's a fantastically better story than Romeo and Juliet. And also, at first, when I like heard of this and heard about them like digging up her body to bring it to court, I was like thinking about why people don't like to hire men to be morticians, and was definitely terrified as to where this story was going. But then I was pleasantly surprised that it was not as horrible as I was like bracing myself for, and I love the story even more for that. But let me know what you guys think, definitely in the comments below, and I appreciate your faces. I will catch you guys all in the next one. Definitely stay tuned to see what we have cracking on this channel, and I'll catch you guys then. Happy crafting, guys. Bye.